So in this lecture, we're going to take a look at some of the top, most common gram-positive bacteria that cause diseases in humans. Now, there are a lot of gram-positive bacteria out there, so I do try to kind of sort through the bacteria, show how they're organized, and one of the big divisions of all of the gram-positive bacteria out there is we divide them based on their shape. And so we are going to start with looking at gram-positive cocci bacteria first, then we're going to look at gram-positive rods or bacilli, but we'll do that in class. So we're going to start taking a look, kind of really starting on the left side of this flow chart, working our way to the right side. Now, of the gram-positive bacteria that are cocci shaped, there's still a bunch of those, and most of the bacteria that are gram-positive cocci actually have coccus in their genus name, so it tells you the shape. But from there, we need to start dividing those out as well, and we start doing that based on several tests we can run. The very first test we can run is called a catalase test, determining whether the bacteria have the enzyme catalase or not. And we're going to take a look at the bacteria that do have the enzyme catalase, the Staphylococcus bacteria. Again, there's multiple Staphylococcus bacteria, some worse than others, and there's another test that can be run known as a coagulase test, and we're again looking for the enzyme coagulase. The bacteria that does have coagulase is the bacteria Staphylococcus aureus, which is the more pathogenic strain of staph. If the other bacteria that don't, common bacteria Staphylococcus epidermidis. So we're going to start taking a look at Staphylococcus bacteria, and in this intro we're going to look at some of the Streptococcus bacteria, some of the catalase negative gram-positive cocci. So first, Staphylococcus bacteria, a lot of staph bacteria is a part of our normal flora. They, however, can become opportunistic bacteria, usually if they get somewhere where they're not supposed to get, or if they start to grow uncontrolled, they're not kept in check anymore by our immune system, by normal flora, other normal flora. When we gram stain them, they're gram-positive cocci, and they really do like to hang out in clusters. And so we've seen quite a bit of staph underneath the microscopes in lab already. They are catalase positive. They have the enzyme catalase, which means when we add hydrogen peroxide, catalase will break apart the hydrogen peroxide into water and oxygen, and you'll see bubbles indicating that that enzyme is there. Now, these bacteria are very tolerant of salt, and so they will grow on a mannitol salt plate because they don't care about a high concentration of salt. They're also tolerant of desiccation, drying out, radiation, and heat, which allows them to survive on environmental surfaces for long periods of time. Now, two commonly cause disease, one more than others, that's Staphylococcus aureus and Staphylococcus epidermidis. Staph aureus is the more virulent strain, causing more diseases. Staphylococcus epidermidis, it's normal flora, it's part of its name, likes to live on your skin, but it can become opportunistic really if it gets into some of those open wounds. Now, we're going to talk about the Staphylococcus aureus first, which is the more virulent strain. And it has lots of virulence factors. These are all things that really help the bacteria out, which then always means it's bad for us. The first structural defense that it has, I've got a couple slides. These are just structural defenses that Staph aureus has. One, it has a protein called protein A. It coats the surface of the bacteria. Here's your gram-positive cocci. It coats the surface, the little orange dot on there. It interferes with our humoral immune response. It doesn't allow the antibody to bind the correct way. And if it can't bind the correct way, because the arms are supposed to bind, not the tail, and I'm like, it can't trigger it for phagocytosis, it can't trigger it for destruction. And so it really inhibits that phagocytosis. It also has an enzyme called coagulase on the outside that allows it to form clots and then hide inside of them. So it turns fibrinogen into fibrin, causes these fibrous threads, and the bacteria hides out in the clot. And it's also capsulated, which inhibits white blood cells from eating it. It's too slippery, they don't recognize it. And the capsule also helps it attach to various surfaces. And again, it has to attach for it to call itself a home and start to reproduce. So several structural defenses. It also has various enzymes as virulence factors. It has a cell-free coagulase as well. So it's got bound coagulase and cell-free coagulase to trigger blood clotting. It has an enzyme called staphylococcus, which helps dissolve the blood clot. So it can hide in the blood clot, but then it has to dissolve it so that it can freely move to places that it wants to. And it has an enzyme known as hyaluronidase that helps break down hyaluronic acid between cells that allow the bacteria to squeeze in between cells and spread. It has an enzyme called lipase, which allows it to break down lipids and digest lipids, which allows it to easily grow on skin and in oil glands because it's a wonderful little food source right there. And it has an enzyme called beta-lactams, which means this is an enzyme that breaks down antibiotics that are in the beta-lactams groups, penicillin being one of them. All the beta-lactam antibiotics are ones that inhibit the making of cell walls. So it's a whole class of antibiotics that inhibit the making of cell walls. Well, this bacteria's got an enzyme that breaks down any of the antibiotics in the beta-lactam group. And so if you try taking penicillin with a Staph aureus infection, it won't do anything. The bacteria can fight back. This is just my little refresher that beta-lactams, those are the antibiotics that inhibit the making of those kind of structural, reinforcers between all those NAMs and NAGs of the peptidoglycan. If they're not there, you've got a weak cell wall breaks apart, and the bacteria dies, which is good for us if you're taking an antibiotic. More virulence factors is that this bacteria has a lot of toxins. One of them is called a cytolytic toxin, which means it's there to break down cells. It disrupts cell membranes so that it can get inside other certain cells, and it can even break apart white blood cells that are trying to eat it. It has exfoliative toxins that allows skin to slough off, which is what you can see in this picture. The skin is sloughing off. And again, that allows, we're removing that barrier. And I'm like, we're removing that first line of defense as skin cells are sloughing off. It has a toxin called the toxic shock syndrome, which we'll talk a little bit more about coming up. And it has enterotoxins. So these are toxins that are associated with food poisoning. It affects the intestines and causes your basic diarrhea and vomiting. Now, how we can pick up Staph aureus kind of depends on what kind of diseases you're going to get. One is you can ingest this particular bacteria in food. It's called intoxications. The toxins are going in because of ingestion. And they have that enterotoxin. And so it's, common foods that this particular bacteria seems to grow and thrive in. Processed meats, potato salads, custards, ice creams. Usually all of those foods are contaminated by some type of skin contact. Someone wasn't wearing proper gloves when they were handling the food, and the bacteria went from their skin into the food. But most people relate Staph aureus infections to be skin diseases, cutaneous diseases. One being called a scalded skin syndrome. It's because the skin turns very red, it blisters, it looks very much like there's second-degree burns. Impetigo, usually get red pustules and just red patches on the skin that are pussy. And then folliculitis. This bacteria likes to hang out next to follicles because that's where those sebaceous glands are, and that's where it can break down those lipids, and it can become infected. Now, other diseases that this bacteria can cause are systemic diseases. That means that this is affecting various body systems. It's traveling around the body. It's not just a skin disorder anymore. It's not just leaving with your basic food poisoning symptoms. Far less common. And I'm like, this bacteria generally doesn't get in and affect body systems. If it does, very serious examples, one of them being toxic shock syndrome. That yes, strains of Staph aureus produce this toxin. They can get into your blood. It can cause you to have severe fever, vomiting, rash. It can decrease your blood pressure. It can be deadly. It can cause bacteremia. This is when the bacteria gets in the blood. This usually happens in healthcare settings that, during surgeries, during some type of wound cleanup, this bacteria gets directly into those wounds and directly into the blood supplies. It can cause endocarditis. It's going to damage the lining of the heart. And unfortunately, if endocarditis caused by Staph aureus, is fatal in about 50% of the cases. Luckily, not very common, but deadly. It can cause pneumonia, and again, lots of things can cause pneumonia, and it can cause osteomyelitis, or inflammation of the bone and bone marrow, usually seen mostly in vertebrae for the bone. So I'm like, it can really get around in different parts of the body and cause serious problems. Luckily not very common, but it is becoming, unfortunately, more common of a bacteria. Now, diagnosing someone with a Staphylococcus contamination or an infection, one is they can culture out the bacteria, they can gram stain it. You're going to see those gram-positive cocci in clusters. We can do a catalase test. It's going to have that positive catalase test, the bubbling with the hydrogen peroxide. Treatment, if it's a cutaneous disease, clean, disinfect the wounds. Methicillin is the top antibiotic. If it's resistant, we then call it methicillin resistant Staph aureus or MRSA. In that case, vancomycin is kind of our top backup for this treatment. If it's causing diarrhea, most of the time they just say let the diarrhea happen and the bacteria will leave. Biggest prevention, good hygiene, washing hands, and proper PPE. Now, the other group, or another division of gram-positive cocci, are the bacteria that are catalase negative. And there's two genera of bacteria. There's Streptococcus and Enterococcus, and we're going to take a look at some of the Streptococcus bacteria. So they're still gram-positive cocci, they don't have the enzyme catalase. No bubbling will happen when you add hydrogen peroxide. Now, when we gram stain them, gram-positive cocci, but these bacteria do like to hang out in pairs and chains. They usually have some type of hemolysis reaction, usually alpha or beta. Few of them are gamma. And we divide the Streptococcus based on some of the antigens that they have on the surface of the bacteria. Now, we can't visually see these antigens underneath the microscope, but we do know we can genetically test for them. Now, the Landsfield grouping depends on what kind of antigen it has. There are A antigens, B antigens, C antigens, D antigens, and even G and F. The only two groups we really care about are A and B, because these are human bacteria, the Streptococcus that can affect humans. And group A, our top one that we will talk about, and we've already talked about in lab, is Streptococcus pyogenes. And then group B is our main one, is Streptococcus agalactiae, that causes human diseases. So Streptococcus pyogenes, this is the bacteria that causes your basic strep throat. It's a group A strep, so it has A antigens on it, and it also has a number of virulence factors, things that allow it to cause disease. One, it can evade phagocytosis. It has an M protein on the outside of it, just like staph had A proteins. This is an M protein on the outside of it that breaks apart complement proteins. And complement proteins are ones that can trigger inflammation and try to trigger phagocytosis to happen. It also has a capsule, so it can hide itself, and I'm like, so that our immune system doesn't see it, doesn't recognize it, and can't ingest it right away. It has enzymes called streptokinases. They help break down blood clots, so it can help spread the bacteria throughout other tissues in the body. It has deoxyribonucleases, which, if you're thinking, where have I heard that before, that DNA is the deoxyribonucleotide. And I'm like, well, this is an enzyme that, yes, breaks apart DNA, specifically in white blood cells. It helps decrease the firmness of pus. It helps the bacteria spread easier. It also has pyrogenic toxins that's going to stimulate fever. It's going to stimulate a rash. It's going to stimulate the body going into shock. And it has streptolysins, which allows it to break apart red blood cells, which on a blood agar plate allows us to see beta hemolysis. Now, that also, and I'm like, helps it, one, get nutrients out of the red blood cells, and allows it to travel and feed off of them. Now, some diseases that this bacteria can cause kind of depends on the progression on various strains of Streptococcus pyogenes. Some are, worse than others, and there are some other group A Streptococcus bacteria out there. And I'm like, Streptococcus pyogenes being the most common one, but there's a few others out there. Most common one we generally think about when we talk about Streptococcus pyogenes, pharyngitis or strep throat. And I'm like, the official diagnosis of strep throat is pharyngitis, is inflammation of the pharynx. It can also lead to scarlet fever following an infection of this bacteria. It's usually the strep throat, not treated. It continues. You're going to end up with a chest rash. You're going to end up with a fever. And it can, like that. Usually sometimes it can lead to damage to various organs. That's usually if left for a long time untreated. It can also cause pyoderma. This will be pus-filled patches on the skin. And erysipelas, which is inflammation of the lymph nodes. Now, I kind of put that blue line right there because some of these other ones underneath it are group A Streptococcus diseases. So that includes Streptococcus pyogenes, but other group A Streptococcus bacteria, not only pyogenes. It can cause streptococcal toxic shock syndrome. It can also cause, can cause organ failure, shock, death. It's not good. It can also cause necrotizing fasciitis. This is a bacteria more commonly known as the flesh-eating bacteria. I'll let you, and I'm like, pull up this PowerPoint and you can click on the link. There was a professor at UWL named Dr. Vogt, and he actually contracted this on his foot. So he kind of, documents it and has pictures. Survived, but serious scars. And so when you hear about the flesh-eating bacteria, it's usually a group A Streptococcus bacteria. A couple other bacteria that are group strep A, rheumatic fever. And rheumatic fever is generally a strep bacteria gets in there, it's not treated, and the actual bacteria causes damage to heart valves, permanent damage to heart valves. So I kind of like my little thing over here. A sore throat can lead to a broken heart because, yes, this particular bacteria, if left untreated and it caused strep throat, could damage heart valves. And it's usually the immune system fighting off the bacteria that actually does that damage of the heart valves. It can also cause a glomerular nephritis. It can affect the kidneys. The particular antigens of this bacteria can accumulate in the kidneys, and the antigens can cause inflammation in the kidneys. It can cause hypertension, and it can cause permanent kidney damage. So I'm like some serious side effects. Now, where this particular group of bacteria came into the news a few years ago, if you remember Bill Paxton, the actor Bill Paxton, he actually died. From this, and I'm like the side effects of it, that he had this particular bacteria. He had rheumatic fever from it as a kid. He knew he had damaged heart valves. He went in for heart valve surgery, and he ended up dying from complications during the heart valve surgery. Now, to diagnose someone with this bacteria, one, we can do a rapid strep test, and I'm like looking particular for the antigens, and we're going to get that little blue line on there. We can grow it up on a blood agar plate. We're going to see beta-hemolysis. We can run a catalase test by adding hydrogen peroxide, and there's not going to be any bubbles. We can also test it against the antibiotic bacitracin because it is affected by it, is sensitive to bacitracin. Treatment, best treatment for Streptococcus pyogenes, penicillin or some derivative of it. Another group of Streptococcus bacteria is the group B Streptococcus bacteria. Again, these have B antigens on them. When we gram stain, they also they're gram-positive cocci. It's part of its name. They also like to hang out in chains. They're distinguished from the group A Streptococcus bacteria because they do have group B antigens on their surface. And they do also do beta-hemolysis, but the beta-hemolysis is smaller zones. And I'm like, which means that you can see that breakdown, but it's usually hiding right behind the colony. It's not quite so obvious. And this bacteria is resistant to bacitracin, unlike pyogenes, which means if you put a little antibiotic soaked disc of bacitracin on this plate, this bacteria will grow right up to it. Now, generally when we're talking about this bacteria, the number one place we usually hear people having this, an outbreak or an infection of this bacteria is usually in newborns. And I'm like, when mom has it, healthy individuals can easily be carriers of this bacteria with no symptoms in their reproductive tract. But after childbirth, infants can pick this up from mom, and it can cause bacteremia, it can cause meningitis in newborns, it can cause pneumonia in newborns, it can cause permanent damage to eyesight. It can cause permanent damage to their hearing. And it happens in about 3 out of 1,000 births. And I'm like, it can also cause serious diseases in immunocompromised patients or elderly patients. And I'm like, but as we're testing and treating, a little less likely for death, but if left untreated, about 25% of older immunocompromised patients die of this bacteria. Most common place we see it though, newborns. Now, diagnosing it needs to be fast. These are brand new babies. And so it's usually done with an ELISA test, looking specifically for this bacteria's antigens. Treatment, it's treatable, penicillin, ampicillin, some top antibiotics. Best bet, just not get it in the first place. And the best prevention is testing mom and having mom take penicillin during childbirth or right before childbirth to decrease those childbirth infections. Some other bacteria I wanted to go over before I wrap this video up is the fact there is another group of Streptococcus bacteria. A lot of Streptococcus bacteria is grouped based on that Landsfield classification, whether they have those A antigens or B antigens, but there is another group of Streptococcus bacteria that don't have A antigens or B antigens, and so they get their own separate group. They're called the Viridans group. They're primarily alpha-hemolytic, so they'll show that greening, that green pigment on a blood agar. Lots and lots of normal flora, alpha-hemolytic bacteria in this group. Lots of normal flora. It's why even if we do throat cultures, this is why most people's plates looked green. It was a bunch of these bacteria. They, however, can become opportunistic pathogens, usually if they get into open wounds and if you're immunocompromised. These bacteria also, because they're hanging out in the mouth, these are bacteria that are eating what you're eating and producing acid and can cause those dental caries or cavities and dental plaque. Our big concern is if any of these bacteria get into the blood supply, they can lead to meningitis, they can lead to endocarditis, usually in elderly immunocompromised patients. It's a top reason why individuals immunocompromised and elderly will usually be given some type of antibiotics before they have a dental visit. Because when you go into the dentist and they're poking in there and they're flossing, and if you don't floss regularly, they're creating those open wounds for these bacteria to get in. Now, there are some of these bacteria in the Viridan group, lots of normal flora. One bacteria we'll talk about in class that's in this Viridans group is Streptococcus pneumoniae, but not found normally as part of your normal flora, but we'll get into that in class.